Welcome to the Reason Roundtable, your weekly libertarian podcast that just 2 weeks from now is going to tape a live evening episode in Manhattan, New York. Go to reason.com/events and act while supplies last. I am Matt Welch, joined per tradition by Nick Gillespie, Peter Suderman, and Katherine Mangu-Ward. Happy post-Easter and Passover, friends.
Howdy.
Hey, Matt.
Happy Monday.
Do you guys want to do a little bit more chatter because my wind-up is a little bit long tonight? So
okay.
Everyone have a good holiday?
Go to hell, Matt.
All right. Speaking of culture wars, we're going to wade into some of this past week's very messy political polarization here in a moment. But first, a word from our sponsors at Donors Trust, the principled and tax-friendly way to simplify your charitable giving. Friends, left-wing mega donors are shoveling money into pet projects that don't reflect American values. What's more, lawmakers continue to push bloated big government policies like so-called student loan cancellation and other programs that will inevitably raise prices and fail to reach the people they are meant to help. All is not lost, though. You can help turn the tide with a charitable giving account at Donors Trust. Donors Trust is a refuge from the storm of harmful, progressive philanthropy and big government wheeling and dealing that's hurting our institutions and, more importantly, our loved ones. Donors Trust helps you maximize your giving while minimizing your tax liability, whether it's defending free speech, empowering entrepreneurs to offer educational alternatives, or fighting green energy extremists who want to consolidate power and raise prices on individuals and families. Donors Trust is the charitable giving account provider for you. Visit www.donorstrust.org/reason to learn more about how Donors Trust can minimize your tax liability and maximize your giving. One more time, that's www.donorstrust.org/reason. Go there today. You'll be glad you did. Okay, American politics seems particularly charged up and weird this week with multiple fronts opened in the culture war, some of them quite complicated to unpack. We're going to start with the perennial topic of abortion, which threw off all kinds of news over the past 7 days. First, on Tuesday, liberal judge Janet Protasewicz, I'm just going to say that's the pronunciation, won election to the Wisconsin Supreme Court by double-digit margin, thus tipping the balance of that body to left-leaning judges. The campaign issue was abortion because ever since the U.S. Supreme Court's Dobbs decision, Wisconsin reverted to an 1849 law, making it a felony to perform nearly all abortions. That has been challenged in court and by a statewide referendum. All of that will eventually be adjudicated at the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And so this swingiest of swing states swung control of its judiciary to the Democrats. And by the way, judges shouldn't be elected. Then, on Good Friday, no less, Nick Gillespie, we had two different district court rulings having to do with the Food and Drug Administration's longstanding approval of the abortion pill mifepristone, also known as the more easily pronounceable RU486. The first ruling, written by a single well-known anti-abortion judge in Texas, declared that the FDA should not have approved RU486 way back in 2000, and attempts to order a suspension. The second, coming from Washington State, basically enjoins the FDA from altering the status quo. As Reason's Jacob Sullum and Elizabeth Nolan Brown have both previously noted, RU486 is the practical ground on which statewide abortion restrictions are currently evaded because the FDA in 2021 made permanent a COVID-era rule allowing for shipments of the drug by mail after a telehealth consultation with a doctor. Some Reason headlines on Friday's dual rulings. Two wrong mifepristone court rulings in one day by Jonathan Adler over the Volk conspiracy, and the Tooch, JD Tuchili, the Rattler. The abortion debate is messy. Two lawsuits against the FDA may make it worse. And let's just throw another one by Elizabeth Nolan Brown. Dueling decisions leave abortion pill's fate uncertain. The last bit of abortion-related news before I stop jabbering. The Florida Senate last Monday approved a 6-week abortion ban, which could go on Governor Ron DeSantis' desk as soon as this week. Current law has the legal cutoff limit in the Sunshine State at 15 weeks. DeSantis, obviously the main GOP presidential challenger to Donald Trump at this time, has said previously that he backs a 6-week ban. Katherine, relieve us from the mansplaining. what do you make of this mess of abortion news?
It's a mess, and it was a very predictable mess, right? So this was the inevitable consequence of Dobbs. The Supreme Court chose this, and here we are. The Supreme Court is going to have to re-choose this over and over and over. Everyone's incentive is to send this question and all related questions back to the Supreme Court as soon as possible. Jonathan Adler at the Volokh Conspiracy, whose headline you quoted, has, I think, very good posts on this in general. He says, listen, the legal reasoning, the legal grounds on which both of these circuit court cases stand are pretty shaky. And one of them, the second one to come out, also isn't very clear on some of its reasoning. Like maybe, I don't know, they rushed it out to go ahead and establish that conflict. Which is a great, future historians will be like, perhaps the legal reasoning isn't here because the case was less. No, it's clearly just like a bureaucratic matter. Always assume that it's bureaucratic. This is us playing out the incentives that the court set up. And I did want to just point to one thing in the Florida legislation that I thought was interesting. The proposal, the 6-week proposal, does still contain some exceptions for up to 15 weeks, which, as you said, is the current law. The exceptions are now rape, incest, and human trafficking.
What?
Which to me is the giveaway that this is. I mean, I have no reason to doubt that DeSantis has a principled pro-life view. I think he's been pretty consistent on that. But this is the giveaway that this is, in fact, about culture war point scoring and projecting who DeSantis is as a candidate into the country on an ever amplified scale. There is nothing that would happen in the context of human trafficking that isn't already covered by existing abortion law. And to include it in there is just to signal priorities that are extrinsic to this very, very important issue that we shouldn't be muddying.
I'm surprised there wasn't a carve out for victims of grooming.
And like fentanyl somehow?
Yeah. Disney Productions.
If the abortion happens in Reedy Creek, does DeSantis still have jurisdiction?
Nick, Politico has a headline up that abortion was a 50-50 issue. Now it's Republican quicksand.
Yeah.
First of all, that should be kryptonite, right? But
I don't know. Quicksand, I like. Okay. We don't see much about quicksand anymore. It was Matt. I'm sure you had many nightmares about wandering into quicksand as a child. I certainly
absolutely
did. It was everywhere.
So is that? Do you think that take is right? Do you think Republicans deserve it? If it is right, are they the dog who caught the car with the Dobbs decision? What's your analysis?
Well, first off, abortion was not a 50-50 issue. And what they were talking about there was more like, how do people identify as pro-life or pro-choice? One of the things, and I had an article and a video about this a year ago, roughly when the Dobbs decision came down. Abortion had been pretty much settled in public opinion from like the early or the mid 70s, right after Roe v. Wade until the current day. Most people wanted abortion to be legal in some or all cases. A very small minority wanted it to be illegal in all cases, which are the people who are running the show now, the Republicans. And if you look at Gallup in 2021, it asked, were you satisfied or dissatisfied with abortion laws? 33, a third of the country in 2021 said they were satisfied with laws. 26% now feel that way. The people who are dissatisfied and want it stricter has dropped from 27% to 15% a year after the Dobbs decision unleashed a bunch of legislative action. The other thing that's really interesting is that everywhere where abortion laws were put up to ballot initiatives to make it stricter, they lost. This is the legal changes are the work of a group of almost exclusively hardcore Republican conservatives who are dramatically out of touch with where the country is, and they are actually sparking a movement towards loosening of abortion laws. And we don't necessarily want to talk about this in terms of public opinion stuff. I think abortion certainly before quickening or viability, which was the legal status or the controlling legal concept in Casey before Dobbs overturned Roe, which gets a little bit complicated. I mean, I think there is absolutely nothing wrong morally with a pre-viability abortion. And conservative Republicans all over the country are forcing that issue in a way that is not only wrong, but is going to be disastrous for them in electoral politics. So they deserve what they're getting.
Peter, I'm giving you two doors. One door is you're from Florida, Ron DeSantis, 6% or 6-week abortion. What the heck is going on? And does that affect his national political standing in your mind? And door number two is just weird state level lawsuits at the FDA. Is that normal?
Let's start with the second one. The crazy thing about the Texas lawsuit and the Texas ruling is that the argument there was basically that the FDA approved a drug too fast. That they were like, they actually allowed, and this was the conservatives making this case. The folks who normally are like the FDA is a bureaucratic organization that is dragging its feet, that has all these processes and all these rules, and you can't all these drug companies that really just want to produce life-saving drugs. They want to get their stuff through the FDA, and the FDA just won't let them. It's hugely costly and times, and incredibly expensive. And somewhat independent from the abortion specific, the abortion valence of this. The drug part of this, the drug approval part of this is really messed up because the argument is that the FDA should be cracking down on drugs and just subjecting them to a kind of bureaucratic oversight that would make drug development at minimum much more expensive and much slower. And that's not something that we want. And also, it's just wrong in this case. As far as I can tell, so yes, they did use a sped up drug approval process. But when the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, which is a pretty good watchdog that is actually pretty reliable when it comes to explaining whether or not bureaucratic agencies followed their procedures, the GAO released a report on exactly this argument in 2008. And GAO concluded that FDA had followed all of their procedures, that they had exercised totally normal oversight for the drug after it was approved, and that there was nothing amiss here. And so this is an almost entirely politically motivated argument that was then brought into court, via in a venue where they judge shopped. This is the other thing that we should talk about here, is that the judge who wrote this ruling, again, you can never say, we know exactly what this person is motivated by, and you should stick with the text of, in some sense, you should stick with the text of the ruling. At the same time, this judge is somebody who is a Trump appointee, who has a history of affiliations with socially conservative organizations. And the groups that brought this case chose this venue in order to get this specific judge because they knew that this judge, shouldn't say they knew, but they had a strong belief and good reason to believe that this judge would rule in their favor. And so we have a lot of kind of political motivations here that I think are unfortunate and are are not going to create good incentives for drug development going forward, because this is just going to make the FDA process. I think that this is going to end up making the FDA process much worse in the long run.
Katherine, you don't vote, and part of your robot heart enjoys pointless political chaos, I assume. Can you imagine this scenario by which DeSantis signs a 6-week ban? Donald Trump, who enjoyed very unusually strong support among evangelical Christians and what remains of what we used to call the moral majority, attacks him for it as being too extreme, and then evangelicals deciding that they're going to back the thrice divorced Stormy Daniels paying off candidate against the actual anti-abortion candidate. Do you like all this, or does it just fill your heart with dread?
It fills my heart with dread. I don't think the thing you described is at all implausible. I think that's a fairly likely outcome. I don't think it'll be quite that direct, because Trump does understand that he's on somewhat shaky ground on the abortion question with his core supporters. Sometimes Trump knows things like that and doesn't care and says the thing he thinks anyway, which is the part that the chaos that my robot heart likes. But I think that in this case, the people who have committed to Trump already know that he is not the banner carrier for the anti-abortion cause, right? That has always been like a squishy part of his platform.
So he appointed the Supreme Court judges that
Bud Gorsuch, always Bud Gorsuch and co. And so yes,
but like he made Dobbs possible.
He made Dobbs possible, and he will make any further victories for the anti-abortion movement possible. Not just the Supreme Court appointees, of course, but also the many lower court judges that he appointed. And but I think DeSantis will have a stronger claim in terms of his personal convictions to being anti-abortion than Donald Trump can argue. But like, what has DeSantis done for abortion lately, or for unborn babies lately? And the answer will now be this Florida bill, right? He will sign this Florida bill. And so he will have something he can point to, which will maybe even the score a little bit.
There is a sense in which Trump is the perfect avatar for the right's current position on abortion, because he is, how do I say this? He's not someone who digs into legislative specifics. And he's also not very consistent. And right now, the problem for social conservatives, for the sort of pro-life activist world, is that they spent the last 50 years or so focusing on the courts. And that was their strategy. And what they didn't have was a plan for what happens after the courts give them what they want by striking down Dobbs. They didn't have a sort of a system of they hadn't pulled it for the most part. They hadn't written up the model legislation. They were just sort of like, well, we'll get there and we'll figure it out. And they are now figuring it out. And what they are finding out is that their preferred legislation is a huge political anchor on the Republican Party. And it is going to be, they are going to have to wrestle with this and figure out what they can do in terms of enacting pro-life legislation, enacting abortion restrictions, because it's not obvious that they can keep getting elected if they keep doing things like 6-week abortion bans in most states.
I think that they probably can at the state level. Which is where this stuff is playing out. And, the thing to, really focus on here is that the social conservatives have lost every culture war battle that they've ever engaged in, effectively. And this is merely the most recent one. And they will drag down the Republican Party because they don't care about larger Republican goals. I mean, people who are fundamentally anti-abortion don't care about tax rates. They don't care about business regulation. They don't care about FDA regulation of anything. They are single-minded. And, that's not always a bad thing, but it does mean that they are going to continue to push for 6-week bans or complete bans in states where they can do it. And, all of this is what triggered the Dobbs decision in the first place. And it is going to be an electoral loser because it is absolutely not where America is. And when people start to see this, they pull back and they're like, okay, this isn't what we expected when we said that we were against abortion. It did not mean that we wanted to criminalize all sorts of activities that we could change through moral suasion, which is actually true. And, one of the fantastic things about the past 50 years under Roe v. Wade was that the number of unplanned pregnancies and the abortion rate declined significantly because women had more control of their reproductive, capacity or whatever you want to call it. And now this is not speaking to that. This is speaking to something else, which is talking about controlling, ultimately female sexuality in a way that is so out of step that it will be a massive electoral loser, certainly at the national level. And it deserves to be.
Nick, just a retort, fact check. Did not they win the culture war on abortion? That's what we're talking about, right? And
it's
one
not
might
over.
Also,
but it's
not over. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. But like when you look at every attempt, and this is part of what conservatives do, they don't actually expect to win. They expect to slow down, momentum into the future. This is, standing athwart history, yelling stop. But literally on every front, whether it was de jure segregation, whether it was homosexuality, whether it was, female social, cultural, and economic equality.
Gay adoption, gay marriage.
They lose because all they are doing is trying to hold on to a past that has already fallen apart because it no longer speaks to where people are. And they're losing this battle, even as they won the Supreme Court case. This is something that, is not going to be ultimately won in the courts.
So I am probably the most pro-life person on this podcast, though I wouldn't quite use that phrase to describe myself. I'm somewhere sort of much more muddled and confused on my actual position here, but I'm more sympathetic to some of the pro-life arguments than I think some of the rest of you guys are. At the same time, looking at this, it really strikes me that one of that a useful analog is prohibition. And that what the Supreme Court's ruling last year did was it allowed for a prohibition, because that's what this is. That's what this ruling from Texas is a prohibition on a previously legal drug. And one of the lessons of prohibition is that even when it seems popular up front, as you are enacting it, even when there is widespread agreement that, this alcohol is causing huge problems in our society, and it is a source of moral rot. Once people experience the reality of prohibition, it becomes obvious to almost everyone that it isn't working, and it becomes politically unpopular. That's what happened with alcohol prohibition, and I think it is already something that is happening with abortion restrictions.
There is one area where Democrats and left-leaners will say that the Republicans have unequivocally won in the culture wars is on guns, which is a good way to transition to our second culture war episode of this particular podcast. Last Thursday in Tennessee, the House of Representatives there expelled 2 Democrats for taking part in a loud and messy protest inside the State House, using bullhorns to shout stuff like "no action, no peace," as a way of demanding gun restrictions in the wake of last month's awful school shooting in Nashville. And even as I'm saying this today, in nearby Louisville, Kentucky, there's been a big shooting at a bank just today. A third member of the so-called Tennessee 3 protesters, and that's not Johnny Cash's backing band, narrowly missed expulsion herself. She happens to be white. The other 2 are black. Always helpful. Republicans say the very unusual move was necessary to maintain basic decorum inside the State House, and compared the Tennessee 3 to January 6th protesters inside the U.S. Capitol. Many Democrats say the move is explicitly racist. Some call it redolent of fascism, and all agree that continued inaction on gun legislation is unconscionable. Katherine, Reason likes both the First and Second Amendment. What do we think about this expulsion?
One thing that I've been really struck by in the conversation around it is the framing of, and actually it matches up with what you were just saying, Matt, the framing of the Republicans as being sort of obstructionist in an unhelpful way, rather than what I think the reality is, which is that they represent a sincere disagreement about the appropriate legislative path going forward. Like, there's this notion that they're being bullheaded, and if they just get shouted at enough or something, they'll move into action, right? Or it's not even bullheaded. It's like they have too much inertia, and they just need to be nudged forward. That's not right. That's not the right way of understanding this issue. And I think it exposes the reality, which is that this is not a question of trying to get action. If anyone who's ever met a human being in a disagreement isn't what really works? If you shout louder, then people change their mind and do what you wanted them to do. That's not what this was about. And instead, it was about drawing national attention, huge success. It was about, painting the opposing party, in this case Republicans, as backward and unhelpful. But I just don't think that's a fair characterization. Like, it's a quite reasonable position to be like, the things that have happened, the mass shootings, are absolutely horrible, and all of the policy proposals on the table from the Democratic Party are not the right approach, and we refuse to pass them. Like, that's just political disagreement. That's not some sort of like character flaw or, something that can be shouted down. And the leads of many articles and the kind of opening monologues of many cable news segments have, even on the right, have kind of granted this premise in a way that I find quite surprising. Like, why? And maybe it's because Republicans are feeling abashed, and so there aren't a lot of clear voices defending Second Amendment rights in this moment, but there should be.
Nick, speaking of shouting,
I'm reaching for my bullhorn, Matt, so that I can make sure that you hear me loud and clear.
So I can hear you clear your throat even louder.
Yes.
You were paying keen attention to a little shout fest that happened with Congressman Thomas Massie on Capitol Hill. What did we learn there?
And Representative Jamal Bowman of New York. Right. It was captured by a Hill reporter. Jamal Bowman was leaving the Capitol building and was shouting about the Nashville shooting and the need to do something. Thomas Massie, engaged him in a conversation or an argument about gun control. That's a radically different situation. Bowman kept shouting, and they weren't in session. They weren't in Congress. They weren't like discussing legislation in the chamber where you pass legislation. I mean, for me, this story is about process. And to elaborate on what Katherine was talking about, if you bring a bullhorn to the legislature and every time somebody starts talking, you shout out through it or you play, one of the songs that are pre-programmed on something, of course you should be kicked out. I mean, that's absurd. And it's one thing if you're outside the building. It's one thing if you are protesting outside the building. But if you're doing that on the floor, of course you're going to get canned. And that also explains why one of the Democratic protest assembly members didn't get expelled. We have given up so fully on process in this country, sometimes for understandable reasons, but this does mirror the January 6th stuff where it's like, if you get a bunch of blowhards who are upset at a particular decision that is made, and they decide to act outside of the normal structures for passing legislation or, contesting elections and things like that, there are consequences to that kind of behavior. I don't think, it's not directly analogous because the January 6 people, were not actually committing an insurrection. It was a riot. It was, and they should be dealt with accordingly. But I mean, this shouldn't be a conversation. If a legislator won't actually follow the process by which, that they were elected to do, I don't know. I mean, I just don't have any sympathy for that.
Peter, Jonathan Turley has a piece in The Hill titled, "I Was Screaming Before You Interrupted Me. American Politics Has Become Amplified Rage." What did you find interesting about Turley's take?
So that title is a quote from Jamal Bowman from when he was outside of the Capitol and had his interaction, let's say, with Rand Paul. I think
Thomas Massie.
Excuse me, with Thomas Massie. Thomas Massie. Yes, and he has a great line in that piece. "Nothing says deliberative debate like a bullhorn," which is about right. We have entered an era in which politics is understood by many of its followers and practitioners as almost entirely just a performance of outrage. And it is often a pointless performance, or at the very least, it's not in any way productive in terms of lawmaking, in terms of legislation, in terms of debate that is designed to convince people. Instead, the point is to gain attention. And so while I know that we're supposed to, be pro-social media on here, I do think that there have been some negative effects in terms of social media style politicking and social media style discourse has now entered our state houses, and it has entered our legislatures. And people see the act of doing politics not as something as being organized around debating, writing, and passing laws, and figuring out what's the right way to have a legislative process and sticking to that. Instead, they see it as basically smashing that tweet button and getting all the likes and going viral, because that's what this is. It is that exact same impulse, except it is done in meat space with a bullhorn.
Do you think that this is also in terms of a longer term trend? The thing that always occurs to me is that this is the consequence of every single person in Washington running as an outsider, even the insideriest insiders, right? If you're like, I'm a cool legislator, not like the other regular legislators, then you've already established that your terms here are, I don't have to follow the rules because I'm an outsider. But if literally everyone runs that way, up to and including former presidents of the United States, then there are no insiders, there are no keepers of the rules, there are no, and of course, the outsider thing is, it's like whitewashing at most in many cases. But I do think if you kind of believe yourself on that front, this is the behavior you get.
I think that stood out to me about the two people who were expelled. Obviously, a lot of attention has been paid to the fact that they were both black. But what was more notable to me was that they were both quite young and quite new to politics. And they embody, I think, a new style of political discourse that is taking over, that is present on our college campuses. I think often in many, unfortunately, right, Turley explicitly makes the case in his piece that this is a scene that we see a lot on campuses where people are trying to speak and have reasoned debate, and they end up being shouted down. We have certainly seen that sort of thing at Stanford and just many, many campus stories like this. And that style of politics, again, I don't want to say that anger and that outrage and that shouting has no place in American politics. I think
far be it from you.
Yes, right. Sometimes shouting is appropriate. Sometimes it's just fun. But I think that when you're bringing a bullhorn into a state house, and you know that at the very best outcome of this, in terms of legislation, is that no legislation that you want to be passed will be passed, and that the most that's going to happen from this is that you will make the evening news, or you will make the rounds on cable news as a result of this. Is that, we have to ask ourselves, is that what we want from politics?
That is what lots of people want who are in politics.
I mean, I think you're right to stress the youth. I'm reading a book from 1980 called Great Expectations, which is about the baby boom generation entering the kind of halls of power. And it stresses how, the baby boom in the late 60s and early 70s practiced politics, and it started on college campuses and in, mass protests of the war and things like that, very differently than the greatest generation or the silent generation. And then, that is how you kind of get your foot in the door. You make a lot of noise and then you settle in and start doing stuff. I think that's part of what we're seeing here, is that millennials and Gen Z are doing what they've been doing at college campuses and are trying to, get in. We all know that, when Democrats are in control of Congress, they do things a certain way, Republicans do others. Again, it's this absolute disdain for process as corrupt and corrupting and inadequate to the, exigencies of the moment. This is part and parcel of the long-term collapse of trust and confidence in institutions, much of which is well earned because politicians have treated, procedure and process as completely, arbitrary and useless if it doesn't serve their particular terms. What I think is really bad here is when you go back to the question of the Nashville school shooting, we don't know all that much about that, but in the other two major examples that preceded this, Uvalde, Texas, and Parkland Florida, what ultimately virtually none of the gun control legislation that's being discussed would have any effect on this stuff, but we're not talking about the massive, persistent, and ubiquitous failures of police, of law enforcement, of social workers, of teachers, all of whom had major touch points with the perpetrators of this stuff and did nothing and failed. And it's like, if we want to stop school shootings, and obviously we do, there are things that we could be doing, and we're not, because we're talking about this kind of stuff. And that is just, it's awful and it's disgusting and it's a real missed opportunity.
I think in the Nashville case, the police acted with ways that at least preliminarily people were quite commendable.
Yeah.
All right. Reminder, we're going to go to our listener email question of the week. Email us your questions to roundtable@reason.com. And you can include stuff like your social media handle, which we do get here from probable Romanian Silviu Tulbia, who you can follow on Twitter at the SILVS Factor, the Silvs Factor. Silviu writes, "Hello, Reason. I love your podcasts and content. Thank you for creating such a great publication. Normally wouldn't read this, but it's a pretty short one. I'm curious what the Roundtablers' views are on things such as corporate personhood, the tax laws surrounding corporations, the fact that corporations never die, and the outsized power of corporations today. Why is corporate personhood necessary, Katherine?"
I went Googling to see what Reason's recent commentary on the corporate personhood question might be, because I do feel like when I was a young libertarian, there was a lot of that. We talked about that a lot. And the last mention that I recall was the Mitt Romney moment where he was like standing on a bunch of bales of hay somewhere, probably Iowa, because that's what this country does. And he kind of made the last stand for corporations or people too. and lo and behold, that does seem to be kind of the last moment that a lot of this stuff was discussed. I retain a fondness for this concept, although I think, like many things, it is better understood as a metaphor than as a literal factual claim. And I think that, in the case of corporate personhood, the idea that we're trying to get at when we talk about this is, are corporations a thing that we can kind of use, abuse, and treat differently? Or do we need to keep in mind that it's just a bunch of people doing stuff together? And, I basically hold the latter view. It's just a bunch of people doing stuff together. And so if we want to, for instance, tax corporations differently, whether at a lower or a higher rate, we are going to nudge the fight about whether corporations are people in the direction of the outcome that the person arguing wants. So there is, for instance, a tradition of liberals arguing for corporate personhood with the theory that it will reduce special treatment of corporations, which I think is an interesting kind of little twist. And that arguably that is kind of the original kind of Gilded Age conversation about this. There are elements of that. When the railroads were getting many, many special benefits and treatments, would treating a railroad corporation like a person actually equalize the real treatment of real people in the eyes of the law? Is like a historical question that has been investigated. So I do think corporations are, like Soylent Green, made of people, and that is probably a better way to talk about it. I think that people might soon never die, and or AIs might be people soon and also corporations. And so I think that this conversation might dissolve into itself in a really interesting way pretty soon. And I am looking forward to that outcome.
Nick, save us from Zoltan Istvan over here.
Hey!
All I was going to say is, the creation of a limited liability corporation so that when you contribute to a business or start a business, you're not fully liable for everything that happens as an investor is one of the things that created modernity and allowed us to become much more productive and to have a lot more stuff with relatively few negatives. So, that's the kernel of corporate personhood. And it doesn't mean, corporations don't get to vote. Corporations don't have to fight. They're not persons. It's a way of talking about stuff. So I think, looking at what corporations are and how it helps people be more willing to invest and try different things is really the most important thing to take away from this conversation. And by the way, corporations die all the time. It's
yes,
so
that's true.
Corporations go out of
Just
business,
not of
et cetera.
biological causes.
Yeah.
Peter.
Well, Katherine already stole my Soylent Green reference, so I'm going to have to go with an Onion article from 1998.
That's
which
good. That's
is
fine.
it was an op-ed that the Onion published, America's finest news source. It's titled "I Just Love Corporations," and it's satirical, because it's a satirical newspaper. Except I actually do just love corporations.
This, but unironically.
Yes, totally unironically. Like just Google that article. That's basically my feeling about them. They're great. They provide us with stuff, right? Like you want a thing, you log into a website, you press some buttons, and then like thing arrives. It's wonderful. They provide us with services. The corporate personhood is often misunderstood. Because it is often seen as this idea that, man, corporations are for legal purposes just exactly the same as Matt Welch. It's just a whole like individual person with all the rights. No, and it's just exactly what Katherine said, is that because corporations are people doing things together, those people are individuals who have rights. And obviously they should. Just because you are doing things in concert with other people in a legally registered form that we call a corporation, you don't lose your rights. That group of people does not lose their rights. And so the corporate personhood is a way of thinking about individual rights when people are acting in concert in a legally registered form with a bunch of other people. And that's all it is.
I remember fondly my first press conference covering the Ralph Nader 2000 presidential campaign, which I was covering for workingforchange.com, the short-lived website run by the Working Assets telephone company. And I was shocked, startled and I started doing a little tally. This is surprising to everyone who knows me. I was just counting things. But of how many times Nader used as a pejorative the word corporate or corporations or whatever, some version of corporate. It was over 60 times. I think it was like 64 times he used that. And it was fantastical to me because you saw that a lot back then in the late 90s with the anti-World Trade Organization protests in Seattle in 1999, which people have forgotten about, but are pretty interesting. Hard hats and turtles together at last. You have this sense in the way it's used in the Naderite way that corporations are mustache twirling, monopoly players, that they're by definition these profit-seeking institutions. They're not. It just means you've incorporated. Reason is a corporation. And yes, okay, we like capitalism, but we're a nonprofit. The Sierra Club is a corporation, people. And the question is, and the reason why we don't talk about this anymore, in addition to Mitt Romney being very embarrassing whenever he's near hay, is that Citizens United was decided. And that was the case that basically said that a incorporated group called Citizens United has First Amendment rights to release and have it legal to release documentary hit piece.
Actually, to advertise that
even
they
to
had a
advertise
documentary
about Hillary Clinton. And so should the Sierra Club have the right to as an organization to promote its views, X number of weeks before an election if it happens to deal with a candidate? And the answer is obviously yes. But people were using the corporate personhood argument against that, saying like, well, no, if you say yes, then you're making corporations into a person. So it's always interesting, just in a similar way to how people use trickle-down economics only as a pejorative. I haven't heard someone, Suderman probably will, but I haven't heard someone say, I actually love trickle-down economics in a good long time. Corporate personhood is the same way. You know what? We need to make corporations people. No, that's not it. It's that we think that groups of people, incorporated people, their activities should be subject to protections from the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment and all kinds of nice amendments there. That's it. So that's why it's necessary.
I also think there's this thing, right, which is that by having the concept of a corporation to use in political rhetoric, it makes it easier to say harsh things about groups of people, right? So Elizabeth Warren is kind of the heir to the Naderite rhetoric here, that she wants to punitively tax various corporations. And, Warren is not too shy about saying, like, yes, because certain people deserve this treatment as well. But there are lots of other people who would like to join her coalition but need a little bit of rhetorical cover. Back during the days of the Social Security, when Social Security was up for debate, which, as we learned in the State of the Union, it no longer is, there's a great Milton Friedman quote about, when people say, oh, well, the corporation pays half of the Social Security tax. And he said, that's nonsense. That's bookkeeping. That's not economics. Right. And it's just like, that's right. Like, there's just over and over this, like, well, it's okay if the corporation bears the costs of regulation or taxation or whatever. People still bear those costs. And it's just like a way of attacking a group that sounds okay.
All right. Lightning round time feels like 17 months ago, but it really was just last week, Tuesday, that former President Donald J. Trump was indicted in a Manhattan court on 34 counts of business fraud, all stemming from hush money he paid to adult performer Stormy Daniels to keep quiet about their liaisons. So let's go around the table, have each one of us pull out one thing from the indictment, the spectacle, the reaction that jumps out to you. Nick, you start.
Mine is, I think that serious kind of court watchers or Trump watchers are already looking at what's brewing in Georgia, where there's a much stronger case that Trump tried to interfere with an election. The New York charges are a joke, and everybody knows that. And you saw people at places like Vox and whatnot who are in no way sympathetic to Trump saying, what the fuck is this? I think
that's a paraphrase.
Yeah. No, it might even be a direct quote. I'm not sure, But, I think the real question is, what's brewing in Georgia in particular.
Peter, what jumps out at you?
What jumps out at me is that this is, at least implicitly, the fulfillment of a kind of quasi-campaign promise on the part of Alvin Bragg, the prosecutor who brought these charges. He did not explicitly promise to charge Donald Trump with something, whatever I can come up with, but he promised a kind of accountability, was the word he used, in a way that was widely interpreted and understood to mean that he would go after former President Trump. And I think, again, you can't stop people from saying stuff like that. And in the end, people have, you have to let people say what they want and campaign the way they want. But it's kind of a gross form of politics in which you strongly imply that you are going to go after a prominent former elected official from the other party as a campaign, as a part of your campaign.
And also, prosecutors shouldn't be elected. Katherine?
I just really liked this quote from Ty Cobb, not that one, but the other one, a defense attorney who represented Trump, I guess, during the Mueller investigation, who said, I think the Bragg case is the water pistol unnecessarily preceding the missile-launching F-35 attack piloted by Jack Smith, in reference to the election subversion allegations. It's a good quote, and I think he's right.
I like the specificity of the F-35 missile attack.
I mean, it's the visual of the Super Soaker as the F-35 like in. It's very good.
Wait, so am I against it then? Because the F-35 is a giant boondoggle?
Yeah, it's true.
It won't be really operational. But the other thing that's great that calls to mind, the fact that Donald Trump constantly suggests that Jack Smith is a fake name. I mean, the thing about Trump is, this gives him a huge new platform or, a real kind of media role that he can bask in. But he's so bad. The more he talks, the more he makes it clear that he will never get more than 46% of the popular vote.
Bold to pit a man named Ty Cobb against a man named Jack Smith in a fake name allegation game.
Yeah,
that is absolutely true. What jumped out at me is the cleverness of a headline or a phrase by our friend, at least my friend and Nick's friend, Eli Lake. I think he's our friend, who over at the Free Press called this fan service prosecution or fan service case. And there's something really
the Mandalorian of prosecutions.
Thank you. And I was watching, because it coincided with some crucial dishwashing in the Welch household. I was watching the CNN and MSNBC coverage when the stuff was being unveiled, when they're covering the Bronco ride from the Trump Tower to downtown, and the replaying a 5-second walk in the hallway of the courtroom and analyzing what it meant that he had to push his own door. I'm not making this up, people. It was amazing.
He was humiliated by that, Matt. Wasn't that the common rhetoric? Yeah. That it's like, oh my God, like Trump's inner circle is leaving him behind because they didn't hold the door open for him.
They were analyzing what the look on his face meant. I literally heard Jake Tapper, not like the bad people, but the better of the people at these places say, are the walls closing? How do you say that without laughing at this point? There's a lot of fan service journalism too, people. Nick said, and he's right to point to, there's been a lot of skepticism about the case in Vox, Jonathan Chait at the New York Magazine, a bunch of other places. But there was a whole lot of Alvin Bragg is a very serious person, and just absolutely ridiculous. Try to read into the deep, dark thoughts of Donald Trump on cable news. There's a lot of fan service associated with news delivery about Donald Trump. And this is the beginning of what's going to be 4 different trials, including rape. The civil rape trial that's coming down in just a couple of weeks. This is what cable news is going to look like for the rest of the year. It's going to be
of our
awful.
Lives. The rest of our lives. And, but the flip, I agree with you, Matt. This is fan service on CNN and MSNBC, et cetera. There's a lot of that on the right, too, who are this cinches the Republican nomination for Trump, because the American people will be so outraged at this obviously fake prosecution. And that really misses the point. If we started by talking about abortion. The reason why there's a reaction to attempts to, really get rid of abortion is because most Americans have a more nuanced view. I think in this case, it will fire up certain sectors of Republican kind of political activism, but most Americans are going to walk away from this saying, this is a bullshit prosecution. But Trump, you know what? I'm done with this guy because he really... and I'm not saying that's good for DeSantis or anything. It's just Trump has not advanced his case in public life, since becoming president. Basically what he did, certainly with the advent of COVID, is he started making even his admirers wonder why they elected him. And that's only going to become more true as these cases kind of go through the process.
All right, let's go to our end of podcast, what we have been consuming in the cultural arena. I understand that we have a joint presentation here. So, Katherine, do you want to take Dungeons or do you want to take Dragons?
Yeah. So, Suderman and I went along with the rest of the Reason D&D crew to see the Dungeons & Dragons movie, Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. And I think that I don't speak out of turn when I say that we were delighted. We found it to be fan service, but the good kind. And that, it was exactly what it promised to be, which was a very, very silly movie about a very silly activity, which is adults pretending together. And I'm not mad about it. Suderman will,
I'm sure...
plot?
Is there a plot?
Hold your pants on, Gillespie. I'm sure Suderman has a substantive riff. What I want to actually speak about, though, is the place where we saw it, the Alamo Draft House, which is a glorious place where you can drink a beer and eat fried foods while watching your movie. And all movies should be consumed in this way. I don't know what we are doing. Get it together, AMC.
Even Schindler's List? Come on.
Yes. Schindler's List
that's an overly broad.
It could be themed if they want to serve matzo ball soup or whatever.
Fish fry,
which many of us had this weekend. It's delicious. Just like want to make the case for more alcohol licenses in movie theaters. That's my libertarian takeaway from the Dungeons and Dragons movie. But Suderman, you want to talk about the actual movie?
Yeah, well, I want to talk about the phenomenon because I think the best way to understand this movie is that it's basically the Passion of the Christ, but for tabletop gaming nerds, right? And so in the way that The Passion of the Christ was a huge hit because it sold blocks of tickets to church goers and Sunday school groups, right? And the idea was there's a built-in market of people who want to go see this movie together. That's also true of Dungeons and Dragons, Honor Amongst Thieves, because there are already people who gather once a week or once a month to play silly games with each other, to enact their weird little fantasies. I guess that's what they are, right? You're a fantasy character in a fantasy game.
To be clear, on point though, that they are Satanists.
Also to worship
they're
Satan.
Playing a deadly
Definitely
game,
Satanists, right?
They're playing a deadly game. They don't understand.
That's one of the great misperceptions about D&D is that it's Satan worship, and in fact, it's heavily based on J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and derived from a lot of the same mythology, and has and that of course was infused with a great Christian sensibility. And I think you could argue that a lot of that was then moved into D&D. It's just that instead of being explicitly religious, it was transmuted into a kind of stats and dice rolling system, right? And it's a secular way of getting to the same sort of thing.
This is me slinking away to erase the pentagram that I drew in my house for our session tonight.
But it really leans into the sort of community fun aspect of Dungeons and Dragons, the silliness of it, the humor, the ways in which people sort of reveal themselves as they play the game. And so if you play Dungeons and Dragons, if you play these games, especially with the same group for a long time, you will learn something about yourself and your friends and the way you interact, even if you are not playing yourself necessarily, even if you are playing a character. And so in this movie, you will see some of the same sorts of interactions that you likely have seen at a Dungeons and Dragons game if you've ever played one. And so you will recognize yourself and your friends in these adventures. They will become they will become kind of meaningful to you, even though they are not your adventures, because you see, there's the treasure chest with the mouth monster that almost got me once. It's a good time, folks.
Nick, what was your mouth monster of the week?
So I stumbled across it. I'm not even sure how it happened. I think it might have been my girlfriend, but I watched Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, which is a 2004 6-episode series that was created by Richard Ayoade, who is best known for his helping to write and act in the IT Crowd, the British TV show, and Matthew Holness, who's another British kind of comedian and actor. And it's from 2004, but it is about a 1980s horror series that was produced by Garth Marenghi, who is a recurring character who's like a shittier Stephen King, who writes and acts in his own kind of Twilight Zone show that's set at a hospital. If you like, Matthew Barry is in it from Toast of London and What We Do in the Shadows. And this is free on Pluto.tv, which is one of the saddest streaming services of all. But Garth Marenghi's Dark Place is one of the fucking funniest TV shows that has ever been made. And however down you are in a given day, you will watch all 6 episodes in rapid succession and feel better about your place in the universe. Highly, highly, highly recommended.
2 points. One is I didn't recognize a single thing that you just said. Not a person, not a show, not a streaming service.
And while that is always my reaction to Nick's recommendations, it is notable that it was yours this time as well.
It is so good.
And secondly, it's obviously a porn with that title.
It is just so no way funny. And, last week I think I talked...
Is it about music or...
No,
sports?
No, it's about drugs. It's about a surgeon who it works at a hospital that has been that is on like a portal to hell. So it's constantly has recurring kind of demonic things going on. There's an episode
that's because
where
they were playing Dungeons and Dragons in the break room?
Something like that. But there's an episode, for instance, about the Scottish mist, which takes over and is seeking revenge on Garth Marenghi.
Is it gender-swapped Buffy the Vampire Slayer in a hospital?
It is so goddamn funny. It is peak early 2000s TV satire, metafictional, because it's like years ago I recommended Comrade Detective. It is like Comrade Detective, but for 80s crappy British science fiction horror stuff. So good. So very, very good.
Just speaking of Satan, whatever noise that Suderman made about a minute and a half ago, the Dean scream from the bowels of Hades was particularly noteworthy. Speaking of religion, I did something recently, last week, that I've never done before, which is participate in a Passover Seder. That's fun.
It's fun.
It was like Dungeons and Dragons. The only thing
like
missing was a dodecahedron.
You kind of go around, you each say a part, you reenact an epic adventure. It is like Dungeons and Dragons, but the food really is fun. Better.
I don't want to give away, too many family
story,
secrets.
I think people know how it ends.
But you haven't lived until you've seen Nick Gillespie recite some of the Haggadah. That's what it's called, the Haagen-Dazs. That was really moving. And it turns out they're mad about the whole Egypt thing. That comes up a lot. Really, really mad about Egypt. Really, what a beautiful thing. I recommend everyone go to a Passover Seder. Ours was led by.
That was interesting too, Matt, because it was led by Israelis. Kind of like secular Israelis, which is a different beast than, religious Jews. It was fascinating. It was great. Wonderful.
We did 2 Seders, as many Jews do. And our second one, we did dealer's choice Seder participation. So each person went around the table. You
ended up with a mezcal Negroni?
Yes. Every person, we went around the table and each person we just did the part of the Seder that we like. The irony here is that the word Seder literally means order. We really did it exactly wrong. But it was kind of great because we ended up hitting all the highlights and actually telling the story in a way that the children at the table, among others, were much more engaged in than slogging through another singing of Dayenu off key. So I kind of recommend Chaos Seder if you want to up your game later.
What's the twofer Seder concept?
So in America, there's this problem, which is you're supposed to have your Seder on the first night, but it's the first night in Israel. And so, the reason we have 2 here is just to cover your bases, to make sure that you are, in fact, fulfilling your obligations to have the Seder on a particular day, since that day is halfway between the days here. So you double up. Also, it's fun. But it's a classic. It's a classic, somebody thought really, really, really hard about the letter of the law and came up with this absolutely non-commonsensical solution. Jews are great at that.
I think is one of the reasons why Christianity took off, right? Because it stresses the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law.
It's what? Just
so it's
be happy Jesus was
in your
born
heart,
pick a day. Yeah.
The other thing I would say for Passover and whatnot too is if you're a Christian, you should definitely check one out because, and this is not news, obviously, but it is a stark reminder of all of the major themes of Christianity. And what Jesus, obviously it coincided with Easter, and what Jesus was here to do. It's really an amazing kind of cultural tradition and a living, breathing one. Just fantastic.
And one about how important it is to be free.
Exactly. No more enslavement. That's all of the dice rolling Satanism that we have time for in this podcast. Thank you for listening to it. Again, we're doing it live in Manhattan, the Village Underground. Go to reason.com events. It's April 25th. That's basically in 15 days, dude. Nick Gillespie, are there other reason.com events that people should be aware of? It seems like there's a lot these days.
Yeah, and there's Reason Speakeasy, a live taping of the Reason Interview podcast on May 1st with Ben Smith, late of the New York Times, BuzzFeed News, Politico, the New York Sun, the New York Observer, who has a fantastic new book, Traffic, that's coming out right on May 1st. But if you go to reason.com/events, you'll see all the information you need for all of the New York City events that are coming up. There's a Soho forum also kicking around that looks pretty good. And you can go to reason.com/newsletters and sign up for the NYC events newsletter if you live in the a metro area of the greatest city on the planet. And check out all what we're doing.
Yes, and if you like our podcasts, go to reason.com/podcasts. If you'd like to give us money, go to reason.com/donate. It's that simple. And we will catch you next week. Thank you. Goodbye.
Now, unlike most board games you might be familiar with, role-playing games often use a 20-sided dice.
Moz,
yeah,
I want to stop listening to this.
I completely understand.